The Late Morning Program with Nam Ras podcast.
And some of it has to do with just personality. You know, I think I was always the kid that read the box of cereal labels,
right?
You know, every word of it.
Yeah.
As I'm having my breakfast, because what else am I going to do with my time while I'm having breakfast? You know, if there's not a newspaper, a book, or something, then you got to figure out what's in the cereal, right? Yeah. So it's also a certain type of personality where you're always soaking up information, looking for content, and to learn new things. If I'm in an Uber drive, then rather than just sit there or look at my phone, it's much more interesting to talk to the Uber driver and figure out what's it like living in this city and how things been and what's his life like. And, you know, in one conversation, I figured out how the Uber app works and how they pay their drivers and how they don't, and, you know, that sort of thing. So you kind of figure things out if you're always in a mode of learning, right? Yeah. That's kind of the key.
But it's interesting because some people do the same thing, but their objective is not necessarily learning, it's social chit. Like some people are just social butterflies and they just chit chat for the sake of chit chatting. Yeah. But I hear what you're saying, where it's something where it's like you're on some level always kind of trying to add to that collection of knowledge. Yes.
And I think when it comes to atyahara, from Nectar of Instruction, over collecting, that's the piece that I need to be concerned about, right? Is like over Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur in his commentary, which Prabhupada quotes, he speaks about this type of it's not just overeating or over collecting of wealth, but even over collecting of knowledge. Yeah. And that, you know, that enthusiasm, that greed to just, I got to do this and I got to read that too. It can actually put you in a state of stress, of anxiety, if that's really your mode of being, is why don't I know this? And why has everyone read this book and I haven't, right? And so stepping out of it is actually a very healthy thing for me to say, no, I'm not going to actually learn anything at this point. I'm just sitting in kirtan. That's all.
That's so interesting.
That's really interesting. And thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
it's very honest of
that.
you. Yeah. I have to admit, when I use the word collecting, it was with the hopes that you would go there. So I was trying to tee you up for, it's like, if I use the word collecting, he's going to go, oh, yeah, Atyahara, okay.
I didn't even notice. That was subliminal.
You know, that's how manipulative I am with the podcast. Right?
Well, Radhika Ramana Prabhu, thanks for joining us for the podcast. That was a little bit intro, but I mean, we've been fans of yours for a long time. I mean, I have. I'm sure Venkata too.
Yeah. Is there a word for... Maybe fanemy is the word? I invent a new word. I don't know if have I ever confessed
because both of you wrote in the BTG back in the day?
Well, okay, so the BTG is a part of it. Also, Nam, your memory of my writing the BTG is way more generous. I think I had more articles rejected than accepted.
Oh, really? Okay.
But Radhika Ramana Prabhu had a regular column.
Yes.
Which I think, was it called India's Heritage?
Yep.
Yes.
It's called India's Heritage, which I always thought was a little strange. I mean, obviously you're from an Indian background and you occasionally would write things that were related to India.
Yeah.
But it was more I think it should have just been called Brainiac Explains It All or something, because it was just this smart kid just writing these smart articles. But I think, okay, so I'm going to explain the fanemy thing a little bit.
Yeah.
And what I contribute to the podcast, by the way, Radhika Ramana Prabhu, is just obscure references from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s that 3 people watching will get, and everyone else will just fast forward through. That's my unique contribution, just random Simpsons episodes that no one else understands. But when I was growing up, there was a show on TV called Doogie Howser, MD.
Oh, yeah.
Of course.
You know Doogie Howser.
I know it because the Idaho Statesman, our main newspaper in Boise, Idaho, published a headline saying Boise's own Doogie Howser.
He's from Boise?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
I was.
He was.
Oh,
Boise.
you-
So so then I looked it up. Like, what is this thing? So I've not watched the show, no, but I know about it.
So I did watch the show, and then and I'm not sure of the dates, so I don't think I was watching the show like
As it was coming out.
or at the same time that like I was learning about you, but it was close enough in time that the association was made. Now, one thing you should know about this show was I would watch this show, and my dad would come into the room and would start to berate me for not being Doogie Howser.
Oh, no.
And I would have to explain to him that it's a fictional character. And that didn't like solve the problem.
So
He was like, but still, like, and it would begin with, like the show would begin with this montage of like all of his accomplishments. And
What was he like 16? He was a doctor already?
he was a doctor by the age of 16 or something,
okay.
like a perfect score on his SATs, like went to college when he was like 10 or something like this. So anyway, so I kind of grew up with this, like these strong feelings around Doogie Howser. And then you come along, and I didn't even see that article, I'm sure, but I made the association, and I was like, I'm getting into Krishna consciousness and finding a home here. And I'm like, finally like a place that I can be myself. And then there's like a Doogie Howser in ISKCON too. But the sort of silver lining on it was in the show, Doogie Howser had this best friend. And the best friend, did you ever, you've never watched the show?
No, I've never watched
But you get the overall reference.
Yes, yeah.
Did you know about the friend?
No.
He had a best friend, and his best friend, and I think this was part of what they were trying to show, was that his best friend wasn't like a genius. His best friend was just like an average 16-year-old who went to the local high school, but they maintained their friendship, and they both kind of learned from each other. And the friend was this kind of over-the-top character, this Italian-American kid called Vinny, who like, Doogie was like the sort of intellectual genius doctor, and Vinny was more of like the kind of the social. He was like girl crazy, and he'd always try to get Doogie into like one of his crazy schemes or something. And then by the end of the episode, Doogie sort of has learned something from Vinny, and Vinny has learned something from Doogie. And when I was a kid, when I was growing up, my nickname was Vinny. So I took solace in the fact that if I couldn't be Doogie, maybe one day I'd meet this Ravi Gupta character, and he'd let me be like his like sidekick Vinny, and we could teach each other things.
I like that. I like that.
So that's how I kind of dealt with those feelings of
Fan of me.
envy, whatever it was. But I remember reading the BTG column. I mean, I remember the first time I read it, the picture that they used of you looked really young in that picture.
Yeah, I was around, what was I, 12, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think I should take this opportunity to publicly apologize to you for all the pain I've caused in your childhood.
I accept your apology.
Oh my gosh.
And yeah, whatever consequences.
Well, you've in the years since, you've more than made up for any inadvertent trauma you caused me through your friendship, through the wisdom that I've like learned from you, the example that you set. So
Thank you.
I think we'll call it even. And
I think the feeling is very much mutual. So I've appreciated both what you do, but also watching how you approach what you do. It's always been in a very thoughtful and very balanced and Krishna conscious way, and at the same time very connected to the world. So I appreciate that.
well, that's really sweet. And I'd love for us to follow up on some of this sort of Krishna conscious and yet connected to the world.
I went to the
kind of
class
piece.
yesterday,
Yeah.
and so many thoughts came to my mind about what we could talk about. And that was one of them, like being connected to the world and being Krishna conscious. And something that specifically interested me was the challenges slide that you had yesterday. I took a picture of it. Maybe we can talk about that. It was like, it was going to talk about it today, but what people say against, or challenging, why we should also connect with the world, or even Krishna consciousness in general, right?
Yeah, or why engagement is
Engagement, right?
yeah, engagement with the world is not desirable or even impossible as a Vaishnava.
Right.
Right? Like, what's the point when when this is a place of suffering, right? And it always will be, and that's not going to change. It's not going to become a beautiful world. At some point, there's no second coming. There's no, apocalypse where everything, God's will is going to be done in this world. It's always downhill from Satyuga downward. And now we're in a 400,000 year stretch of really downhill.
Right.
And so
I can see why you like this so much. It's quite an optimistic classic.
What's the point, right?
Yeah.
What's the point? So that was one.
That's the challenge.
That's one of the challenges. Yeah, let me pull up.
So just to be clear, this is not your position. This is what you're saying.
Correct.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And then how do we respond to that
and
from within our tradition?
And then there was detachment. Detachment
yes.
from...
Our goal is to be detached from the world anyway. So why be engaged with it? It seems the opposite, right? Like engagement is the step before marriage, and marriage means attachment. So if I'm going to be engaged with the world, how can I possibly be detached from it? So that was another challenge. So I spent the bulk of yesterday's talk making an argument for why, as Vaishnavas, we need to be engaged and where we can find good models of engagement in Srila Prabhupada's life, but also in our scriptures like Narada Muni's life. And then ended by saying, but these are the issues, right? And these issues are raised not just within devotee communities, but also some of them, at least, by scholars on the outside of the tradition looking in and saying, there's very little capacity for engagement here because, like one of them was, you don't have a social vision. This is all about individual perfection. And so
where's your system of ethics? Where's your...
Exactly. Yeah. So, and then the idea is that in today's talk, I'll try to lay out the building blocks of an engaged Vaishnava theology. What would that look like from my perspective? And there's 8 building blocks there, but more could be added. But I'll offer kind of the beginnings of that theology. Yeah.
I've noticed you in other classes and workshops that you've given, you often follow this sort of framework. I don't know if it's a conscious choice or if it's sort of just part of your process of thinking through something. But I've noticed that, a number of times where it's kind of arguments for, arguments against, how do you respond? And then kind of, trying to reconcile or strike at some kind of balance. Like how have you like arrived at that particular framework?
I don't know if really it began in a conscious way at all. I think there's 2 things that probably have influenced that over time, just looking in hindsight. One is my training in philosophy as an undergraduate. Different philosophy programs are different, but my philosophy program at Boise State, they were on our case to pare down the argument to the bare minimums, to leave out fluff and to just, what's the for, what's the against, what's your conclusion? And I think that training kind of set into me at a very formative time period. I was, as I said, between 13 and 17 years old at that time, which is very formative. And so it kind of
come back to that.
It kind of set deeply, in me. And I think the other aspect of it has been since then, as a full-time professor, teacher for now almost 20 years, and just recognizing that you always have to ask the so what question for your students. It's just, if you don't create the problem, no one's going to be interested in your solution, right? You have to show the problem. And sometimes demonstrating the problems means overstating it, right? And I said this last night in the talk. I said, I'm exaggerating here, right? One of the the points was that God is aloof. There's an aloof God.
Yes.
He sleeps while creating the world. So when he's engaged in lila in his own world, and then when he does pay attention, he doesn't pay attention. He as Mahavishnu, he's in yoga nidra and he's creating the world, right? So he's too distant. He's too aloof. Now that's an exaggeration. That's definitely over the top, right? But that's the point. You have to create the problem. You have to demonstrate just how far you can push the issue in order to show why a solution is needed at all, right? Before you can present a solution. Otherwise, presenting a solution to a problem that doesn't exist in the mind of your audience is a recipe for making people fall asleep.
Yeah. On the other hand, there's also the danger of, if you're framing the problem, you can frame really easy straw man problem to knock down. So how do you resist that temptation?
Yeah, and this is where academic training, I think, is very useful, because it's one of the things that's drilled into us all throughout graduate school is if you're building an argument and you're drawing on evidence that supports your argument, but also evidence that doesn't support it, then that author should be able to recognize themselves in what you're saying. They should be able to go, oh yeah, he got it right. Like he expressed my argument very well, thank you. Before you can tear into it, you have to be able to give them the time and the space to express themselves. And so that's otherwise it's a big fallacy. Right. To the straw man is a logical fallacy, essentially, that you create an opponent that doesn't really exist. And there's we see that all the time, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And then the other danger is, or maybe it's not a danger to you, but I was kind of thinking of this, like, what if you just do such a good job of establishing the problem that it's like, I don't know, maybe it's just like an insecurity, but like, do you have like a little bit of fear? Like, wow, like I've set this up. Like I've created this picture, to use your example, I've created this picture of an aloof God. Like, am I going to be able to rescue him? Or by the end of the class, are people going to go, no, he was more convincing when he gave that, you know? Or in the case of like a 2-day seminar, what about the devotee that's not going to be able to make it today? You've left them hanging with like 8 really good or whatever number of really good arguments to not engage.
Yeah, this was a concern when I gave a seminar at ISKCON Silicon Valley on, this didn't turn out to be the title in the end, but initially the title I thought of was The Glories of Mayavad Philosophy, How to Defeat It, something like that. I think it was. And the reason I started with Glories of Mayavad Philosophy is because I really feel that there's no way to really address the concerns of impersonalism unless you understand why it works. Yes. And so in that seminar, I told the devotees early on, I said, please make sure you come tomorrow, because otherwise you will all Mayavada Bhashya Shunile Hoy Sarvanash, right? So you're going to leave this and I will be the cause of Sarvanash, of complete destruction. So please do come back. So for that one, it really was a concern, because I spent a good 2.5 hour session just laying out why Shankaracharya's and his follower system works. I mean, it's one of the most interesting, attractive, effective philosophical systems in India. And you can't just dismiss it. You can't just say, "Oh, that's ridiculous. These guys were jokes," because they weren't. They were among the most brilliant minds this world has produced, and they're convincing for a reason, right? So it's one of the things. Like, even if they're your opponents, one of the worst things you can do as an athlete is to underestimate the opposing team. Yeah. And if you think they're a joke, then guess who's going to turn into a joke at the end of the game. Yeah.
But I'm always trying to go into these like places, but
go for it.
In our collective devotional community and in organizations, ISKCON, but others also, I don't want to just pick on ISKCON, it's kind of become like what you're describing, the sort of creating the straw man, opponent and treating impersonalism, Advaitavad, Mayavad, whatever you want to call it, as a joke. I mean, that's kind of the way like 90% of our engagement with the Advaita philosophy, that's kind of what it is, isn't it? I mean, that's kind of how most speakers present it, right? It's this joke. It's completely illogical. It's like, it's almost like we're just like, this is stupid. Like, why would anyone actually believe this? And yeah, I mean, tell us a little bit about like your sort of how you decided to take this other approach and really just go into like a full day of really, articulating what actually makes so much sense about this philosophy before getting into its critique.
Yeah, I think, excuse me, all of my seminars are products of long-term thinking. So I never start with a topic by saying, hey, that's a cool topic. Let me do some research and figure out what I want to say about it. It's always, a product that develops organically over develops organically over a fairly long period of time. Some more so, and some, just a few years. But and with this Mayavad one, it was really something that went back to my graduate years in Oxford studying Jiva Goswami and recognizing that Jiva Goswami knows Shankaracharya's Shariraka Bhashya, his commentary on Vedanta Sutra, very, very well. I mean, he knows it. He knows it so well, so as to refer to Shankaracharya's. In one place, he refers to the method that Shankaracharya uses in the second commentary he has on this one sutra in the entire Vedanta Sutra. I had not read Shankaracharya's commentary. Excuse me. I had not read Shankaracharya's commentary at that point. I didn't know he had two commentaries on that sutra. He gives two alternate versions. And more so, he was extracting the method, not the content. The content he disagrees with, the method he was extracting as a point of agreement with his opponent. Like he was trying to apply the same method in the Sandarbhas. And I remember at that point recognizing that when Jiva Goswami is arguing against Advaita Vedanta, it's because he understands it. He knows it very, very well. And then you read Prabhupada's purports in Chaitanya Charitamrita. There's this 5-page purport or something talking about the debate between Shankaracharya and Ramanujacharya about the Pancharatra. And I mean, it's a very technical debate, very detailed. And there it goes. Like it's just on and on. You really have to dig through it to make sure. So recognizing that thoughtful philosophers and theologians in our tradition are who they are because they take their opponents seriously. They don't consider them jokes. Now, there are versions of impersonalisms that are jokes, right? Like that are very cheap, and you might call them pop impersonalism or whatever. We all get along, we're all one, that kind of thing. So sure, there are aspects that are joke-worthy, but the heart of the tradition, its history is very respectable, and we need to treat it as such, even though we disagree, right? Even though we thoroughly disagree with that position.
Yeah.
I think also the way Srila Prabhupada explained it, or reaction to it, was like a very strong reaction, and so people want to emulate that without maybe knowing the full story of studying it like really deeply.
Yeah. It's almost like you want to sort of emulate or even, I would say, even imitate the kind of like fierceness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Without the sort of scholarly or like theological chops to back it up, right?
Yeah.
So like to your point, Prabhupada's in that purport, he can get into all this technical stuff. He knows because he knows his stuff, and he may not be directly citing to it. And it's something that I was like, maybe you can shed some light on, because my understanding of the way Prabhupada writes is he doesn't always cite to his sources in the way that, we're used to in academia or something, but he's drawing from previous acharyas, and so there's substance to what he's saying, even if the tone is kind of strong or even strident.
Yeah.
And sometimes we're really good collectively at like imitating that like strident tone, but then not necessarily backing it up.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's like, if you've got a boat in the ocean, the waves are huge, right? And they're fierce and they come over you. But the reason that works is because there's depth below it, right? And it's unlike, say, one of these wave pools in
like an amusement park.
Yeah. It's like it's all wave and there's no depth. There's no way you could possibly drown in it. There's no risk involved. The wave is strong, but you can, stand up to your waist in water. And I think that's often where we end up, is because that depth isn't there. So we're all fierceness.
Yeah.
And then, but you can't drown in it. It's not deep enough, right? To actually even swim, not to mention drowning. And so I think that depth is the foundation. And then once you've got that depth, then you can deploy it in very gentle ways and in reaching out ways and interfaith ways. And you can deploy it in debate and argument and fierceness. You can use it all kinds of, and we see that in Prabhupada's character, right? Like there are times when he's really reaching a hand out in friendship with someone whose philosophy he doesn't really agree with, or not entirely, and other times he's being fierce and he's, you know, being extremely strong. And so that's your, you can do that effectively if you've got all this depth to draw from. Otherwise, it just becomes a very kind of surface. You've got all the form and not the substance.
Right. Did you want to get into like the very beginning, or?
Yeah, if we can. Although I'm
This is
liking
this is super fascinating.
Yeah. I guess all these things are connected, but you know, it's sort of. Well, I'll say it's really fascinating that you've sort of arrived at this point in terms of being an academic, being a practitioner, still identifying really strongly with this particular tradition, and not just this particular tradition, but like particular communities, right? So case in point, like later today, you're going to be giving a seminar at one of the local ISKCON temples. You frequently do that. So you're really plugged into this kind of community, and yet also living this life as an academic. And so I think, you know, that's something that I would love to, or we would love to really kind of get into, is like how you sort of hold those spaces and stay sane. But then maybe even taking it back further. Did you always know you wanted to be an academic? Like, how did this sort of come about? When you were reading like the cereal box at the age of 7 or whatever, did you? Yeah, take us back to that.
Yeah, when I first started undergraduate studies at Boise State University, I didn't know at that point that I would be an academic, at least not in the humanities. And I did philosophy. I took an intro to philosophy course, absolutely loved it, and just wanted to keep doing that, and realized that the philosophy major was flexible enough that I could do philosophy with a more practical, real-world major. And that was going to be math. And so I did philosophy and math. And math was a
just if he wasn't like every Indian parent's dream already. He's like, no, I'll also do math.
Also do math.
And I thought, okay, with the math, I can get a job and I could,
Right.
Wow. So you're
support myself.
That's what you were thinking. Your day job would be like.
Yeah, like an insurance actuary or something. It was just, what are all the things you could do as a mathematician? Right. I didn't like computer science. I took one class in programming and didn't like it. And so, but I thought math is the foundation of a lot of things I could do. And then with the math, realized that I was, all the stuff in math that I loved was all totally not practical. It was not the applied stuff at all, even though I got a degree in applied mathematics. Yeah. But the courses that I actually enjoyed were all theoretical and foundational math. And I started to realize that I was incurable. I'm not gonna, I can't stay away from the humanities. Around the same time that my professors started saying, you can actually make a living doing this, right? You could, it's not gonna be a luxurious life, but you can make a living and you can support yourself and do what you love. And then I discovered the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. I actually met Shonaka Rishi it was a very kind of, in my mind, a very fortuitous meeting. In his mind, it was entirely planned, but in my mind, it was like, wow.
He was like headhunting you or something?
Yeah. we
bumped in. Oh, I'm here. Like they bump into each other at like a bus stop in Boise. Little Ravi Gupta was like, oh, wow, what a coincidence. Sean Gishwar was like,
We were at ISKCON Communications Seminar.
Okay.
In Los Angeles. It was actually I think it was first or one of the first ones happening in the United States.
Oh, wow.
Hanumatpreshaka had organized it. Wow. We went to the Los Angeles Times and met the religion editor. It was a great experience. Talked about media and how that works. You know that world. And so, and we were on the bus going from the Los Angeles ISKCON temple to the Los Angeles Times in downtown. And I got on the bus and sat down, and then Shonaka Rishi Prabhu came up the bus and sat down right next to me. And we started talking, or he started talking about, he has this amazing way with giving young people a sense of direction in their life. He will sit them down in a room and they will leave inspired to do so many things with their life, right? So he sat down next to me, and as he always does, he says, "So what do you plan to do with your life?" And it's a question that I was not prepared to answer. And the conversation just kept on going, and he told me about Oxford and how they're running an academic center there. And that really created a sense of purpose in me, a sense of vision, that I could be this person, that like, this is what I love, but then just what you love is not enough, right? You need someone to turn that into a vocation for you, someone to turn that into a career path. How do you do what you love in a way that's useful for the world and useful for yourself? And he did that. Like in that conversation, he kind of provided that vision. Yeah. So it was the only place I applied for. When I applied for graduate school, I was so determined. It was really foolish in hindsight. But I just, that's where I wanted to go, because I wanted to be part of that vision that he had articulated, and that community of scholar devotees, right? Academics, and academics done in a way that is still grounded in one's own tradition, right? And at that time, a couple decades ago, the American Academy was much more resistant to the idea of practitioners studying their tradition academically than it is today. Right? It was much more resistant, and so there weren't.
Which is saying a lot, because I think there's still a lot of resistance.
Yeah, there
so
is.
that there was even more so. You're saying
Even more so.
Were these are early days, right? So were there other models for you, like within the devotee world, that you could look to and say, oh yeah, it's possible. I see so and so is doing this, and
not many. So Tamal Krishna Goswami was studying at the time. So he actually moved to Oxford soon after I got there. He was a couple years ahead in his PhD, or maybe more, maybe 3 years ahead. But in his final year, he didn't need to be in Cambridge where he was studying, so he moved there, and that was a wonderful example for me. And then Krishna Kshetra Maharaj were there, and we were classmates. We started our masters together and our PhDs together, and we've continued collaborating.
You've continued to be like kind of a dynamic duo around, especially the Bhagavatam. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So he was a great role model for me. He was, senior, much more senior, and he had so much experience in the Vaishnava community, but at the same time, someone who really took seriously his integrity as a scholar. And that's with Tamal Krishna Goswami, Krishna Kshetra Swami, and then the third person I would credit is Professor Narasimhachari, who's a Sri Vaishnava, passed away now, but he, a former department head and professor at the University of Madras. And with the three of them, I saw the possibility of being deeply committed to one's tradition and yet having the utmost integrity as a scholar, right? Like not being afraid to say, yeah, that's not historically accurate, or no, that doesn't work, or no, I can't, I'm not going to write like that because that's not according to the norms of what scholarship and history and philosophy and theology require, right? So the possibility that you can have integrity in both of those areas, that it's not mutually contradictory, because at the time, a lot of people would have said, these are impossible to do together, right? If you go into scholarship, you can't practice.
Did devotees tell you that?
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't, I would say, so blunt. It was a warning. I received many warnings, and I received those warnings with a lot of gratitude. I still do, because for as many examples there are of this working, there are also twice as many examples of it not working.
Oh, like, so if someone goes into that, then they kind of leave the path of practicing and things.
Yeah, it's sort of an organic process where their practice as a Vaishnava personally goes by the wayside,
right? Or
they can't stand the academic environment, and and I've had enough. Yeah, right. Like this is over.
Right. Okay.
So what they choose, one of the two,
right?
And warnings that I would receive regularly from devotees. For me, I took those with a lot of gratitude, because I thought, this is Krishna telling me, even if it's a bitter pill, this is Krishna telling me that if you're going to pull this off, it's going to be, number one, difficult, and it's going to be an ongoing process. Like, it's not going to be a one and done. Okay, now I did it, right? Now I have a PhD and I'm still a devotee. See, it's actually a lifelong process of staying grounded and competent, of a very competent in both of those areas, right?
Yeah. Because I mean, part of it I would imagine is, it's like, you know too much, right? You know too much on either side, in a sense.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's some devotees that, and I'm trying not to be too judgmental about this, but there's some devotees who are just like, no, I don't want to know.
Yeah.
Like, I just want to know what I learned from within the tradition. Like, we say that this text was, composed 5,000 years ago and in this way, and was given, in this mystical way. And that's the literal truth of it. And anything else is just blasphemy. And, but you can't do that if you're trying to, with integrity, and inhabit both these worlds. So what do you do?
I respect that. I respect people who say, I don't want to know, I don't need to know, right? Because, I mean, one of the principles of our tradition is that knowing is not a prerequisite to being Vaishnava, right? And so, I mean, you have to know some things. But if someone says, that's atyahara for me, like, that's too much, I know what I need to know. I totally respect that, because at some point, even as an academic, you have to, as I mentioned earlier, right? You have to draw that line and say, I know what I need to know for this paper or this book. I have to stop somewhere. Like, I'm not going to keep, at some point the research has to stop, the writing has to begin, and then you got to say goodbye to your book, and that's it. You have to move on. Yeah. So I respect the fact that people have different points at which the need to know is enough, right? For me, that need to know has always been, because of my nature, it's always been, quite some distance before it's enough, and I have to kind of tell myself, okay, that's enough, right? But that hunger to know is always there. And as you said, what happens is, you know too much about the academic history and the scholarship around it, and you know too much about the institution and all its vicissitudes and the practice, and now you're living in two worlds that are not perfect, right? I mean, as an undergraduate, every professor has a halo around them, and they're just like God. They're, wow, you know everything. Yeah. And anything you say must be true, right? After all that study. And in graduate school, that halo starts to disappear. And by the time you become a professor, it's gone, right? You realize these are human beings who are motivated for all kinds of reasons, like I am, right? Yeah. And they've got their strengths and they've got their weaknesses.
And their blind spots.
And their blind spots and everything, right? Yeah. And then as a devotee, it starts off similarly too, right? Every devotee, every senior devotee has a halo around them, and everything's beautiful and perfect. And then you realize, wow, there's a lot of beautiful and very wonderful devotees. And then there's this other side to institution, which is less than perfect, and people have different ambitions and they have conflicts, and it's like, whoa, okay. So as you learn, you come to recognize, actually, our world is a messy place, right? Yeah. And I need to find, I need to be grounded in the middle of all those whirlpools.
That's no easy task, right? To be grounded, and I mean, it requires a certain kind of humility too, which we've talked about this, which we so much appreciate in you, right? To have that kind of capacity of knowledge and wealth of knowledge, but to also sort of be in that humble position of not judging, and kind of, I mean, well, on that subject, I guess, do you ever just get like frustrated, like within ISKCON circles, when devotees are just wrong, when they're just historically inaccurate or just like illiterate about our own tradition, and they just say something and you're just like, that's not right. Like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that happens, but it also happens at conferences. It also happens in the classroom. It also happens in department meetings where people just get stuff wrong. and it and I do that. I get things wrong, and people point it out, and they say, no, I think that fact was wrong, or I think you overemphasized this point. People come up after a class and say, I don't know, Prabhu, the balance was a little off there, So it's, yes, that happens. But I think the important thing is to recognize that that's a facet of human existence in general. Like, that's part of being a human being. It's not something that's unusually the case with a religious community or an academic community or a social community. That's how our world runs, And so that frustration is there, but I think it's also, for me personally, a test of ensuring that I remain grounded as a devotee has always been, can I sit in a Bhagavatam class and listen while gaining something from it, right? Like, that's, for me, if it becomes impossible or difficult for me to sit in a Bhagavatam class by someone who's not a PhD and listen because, like, oh, look at the Sanskrit pronunciation, it's terrible. Did you hear that? And they define this word wrong, and they miss this very important point, right? If that's the only thing that's going on in my head, then I'm losing something.
I love that.
I've
That's
lost
so
something.
impressive and so true.
And the Radhika Ramana Prabhu, I mean, I hope you don't feel awkward and I know it's sometimes that, like, the nature of a podcast is a little awkward. I was listening to a podcast. I know you don't like him so much, but I was listening to a podcast that Trevor Noah was doing with the actor Orlando Bloom, and he makes this point. I really appreciated it, that, like, there's something very, like, inherently awkward about, like, the podcast format where you're sitting with someone that you genuinely appreciate and you want to appreciate them, but it sounds like you're just like, and then it's so awkward for the person to sort of accept this kind of compliments that sound like flattery. So acknowledging the awkwardness, but I have to say, one of the things that has just struck me so deeply is how graciously you listen. Like, I've been in contexts where, I think I've been in very frightening contexts where I've been the speaker and you've been in the audience. Thankfully, that hasn't happened too often, but I can remember at least one instance recently where that happened.
It was a great talk.
It's a terrifying experience, just so you know, from the other side. It is a terrifying
Come on,
experience.
you're a good speaker.
My apology again,
I mean,
right? This is like a theme for today. I'm sorry.
That's why
Why are you making him feel so sorry?
I don't even know if these cameras are actually recording. This whole thing is just for me. It's like a big therapy session for me to just
It's always a therapy session
to
for
get
you.
I know, right? What have I turned this podcast into? But no, you don't need to apologize. But I have to say, and I've been in other settings also, and I think you have too, Nam, where, like, we've been in those settings where you've been in the audience or where you're part of the group, and you just model it so well. That's, like, so genuinely gracious, and open and open-hearted and non-judgmental, and that's so difficult to do.
Some of the point that you were making yesterday, which I feel is sort of connected, is that it's not just enough to be right. You have to. It was like, what's more important, being right, is being compassionate and kind.
Yeah.
What was that point in regards to yesterday?
It was about that an engaged Vaishnavism, an engaged Vaishnava practice requires us to step outside of our comfort zone, to take a risk, to leave, to not stay in our lane, right? Because staying in your lane is doing the right thing, and doing the right thing is good, but it's not glorious. It's a Vaishnava is called to do more than that. You can do the right thing and be entirely selfish.
Right.
Those two things are not incompatible. And history is full of religious people who do the right thing and in the process act very selfishly. Right? A Vaishnava is called to say, that's not enough. You have to do not only what's right, but what's helpful, what's beneficial, what's good for others, what's compassionate.
Right.
And that was in relation to talking about Prabhupada's life and how staying in Vrindavan would have been the right thing, right? He would have been completely without criticism. That's the lane talking about staying in
Staying
your
in
lane.
your lane,
That's
yeah.
the lane
Yeah.
for a sadhu, right? Is stay in Vrindavan, worship the deities, you get madhukari, 2 chapatis a day, and life is good. And there's nothing that anyone would blame him for. In fact, leaving his lane was both risky and a source of blame. People were criticizing him for going out and not just sticking with what was expected. And so that's kind of the challenge for a Vaishnav, for a devotee, is to say, okay, how can I be more than right?
Yeah, I think that has so many different applications, right? Like I wasn't even thinking in the sense that you were talking about with Prabhupada, the right thing to do. But I think you could apply it to sort of staying in your lane, your comfort zone of the right thing to do, but also just sort of being right, like factually right, but contextually inappropriate or insensitive, right? And I think about this also from the standpoint of trying to offer like pastoral care and pastoral presence, where sometimes you can be philosophically just 100% on point and it's just the wrong thing to say or do or be in that moment.
Yes. And so I often like to remind myself that the key to doing a service well is to recognize that it's just one service. That's all. And there's so many others. It's not the one thing that's going to save the world. And I think if we become academics and scholars, and then we do our job well, and then on top of that we layer this idea that the only way anyone can get it right is by being like me, right? Being like a professor. Otherwise, you can't get it right. You can't get the Bhagavatam class right. You can't get, management right. You can't get anything right because you're not like me. You're not doing my service.
Yeah.
That's arrogance, right? You can do that with deity worship. You can say, this is my service. But in addition to that, I'd like to point out that unless you do deity worship exactly according to every rule and regulation, this is the cause of all your problems. And this is the solution to all your problems too, right? And so what happens is we get some success in some service, and then we climb a high horse and we say, actually, this is the one problem that will solve, this is the one solution that solves everything. And we universalize it so that then it puts down other people's services. So for scholars in particular, I think, but any kind of service that gives you a platform. So deity worship gives you a platform, right? Teaching gives you a platform. Any service that gives you a platform, for those services in particular, I think it's so crucial to remember this point about humility, that it's one service and that's all it is, right? It's gonna be useful for this thing, and every other service is just as important. So your service is neither the cause of everyone's problems nor the solution to everyone's problems. It is a piece of the solution. And if we don't universalize like that, then I think we allow everyone to coexist in and flourish in their services, even if that service is very different than your own.
Yes. And then you can appreciate devotees who are very different from you.
Yeah.
So on that note, I have a question. I want to preface a question by asking you a more technical or historical question, but it's just something that's kind of often on my mind. I don't know if it's historical or cultural or whatever, but I'll ask it. So in our tradition, what is your understanding? What is, in your understanding, the general sort of etiquette around asking someone about their guru? And I've heard so many different things about this, right?
Oh, that's so cool.
In ISKCON, there's a kind of a common, or in many pockets of ISKCON, there's sort of a common practice of just being like, who's your spiritual master?
Yeah.
Whose disciple are you? I've heard from other Vaishnavas that's like very, like actually it's a very personal, intimate thing, and you wouldn't do that, and you shouldn't do that.
Keep it secret.
Keep it secret. And so it's really kind of ranged. And I'm just wondering, sort of with your depth of knowledge about not just our contemporary tradition, but like historically, if you could, shed some light on that. And then I'll actually ask the follow-up question.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer because there are different perspectives on it. In esoteric traditions, and our tradition is an esoteric tradition at some level, that it is a secret matter. Like, this is your mentor, and this is someone who's helping you practice bhakti, sometimes in very deep ways, why advertise it to the world, right? Because you're revealing a lot about your practice as well. If this teacher, this guru is teaching you in this way, and this is how they teach, and then you're sharing something about yourself. On the other hand, this is probably the most public piece of information traditionally in a culture that you can find, which is, who are your parents? Right? So when I meet a child or a teenager or even an adult, and I'm trying to make a connection with them, oh, you're such and such brother, aren't you? Or you're their cousin, and is this your parents? Or and so you're trying to make family connections, which is a very natural way that human beings find common ground. Is they look for relationship connections that they have to connect new people with existing networks. That's the foundation of LinkedIn or social media or whatever, is how do you create those networks? And human beings have done that typically through family relationships. And the sampradaya, or one's guru or one's lineage, is a family relationship. It's a way of connection that's not based on blood, but on a lineage of spiritual practice. So, it's one of these things where I don't think there's a right or wrong way. Like, if someone says, how dare you ask who my guru is, then okay, no, we should not ask, right? Like, that's not your preference. But at the same time, I don't think that's a universal principle of any kind. Similarly, the idea of like, hi, what's your name and who's your guru? Okay, that's not a universally. So I think it's really about being human in a situation and recognizing that, say I meet someone new at a party or a conference or someone's home, how do you get to know that person, right? You ask their name, their background, what do they do? You talk about some shared interests. In the process of that, you say, hey, do you know such and such? Oh yeah, I know that. Really, you're related to them? Okay, well, what's interesting is my wife is also, really, and it emerges, right? So I think that's where we want to be, is just kind of this human space in the middle, rather than either carrying it as an ID card or keeping it as some sort of secret that I'm not going to tell anyone, even though everyone really knows.
Yeah.
Where did the question stem from?
The question kind of stemmed from my own curiosity around your relationship with and I'll put it in the plural, which is something that I've found for me personally is helpful, because it also reminds me that even in our tradition, we do have multiple gurus, although we have generally one Diksha guru, right? But it kind of stemmed from my curiosity around your teachers, your mentors, on the academic side, yes, but also in terms of your own practice, and in what ways they're sort of similar to you, in terms of your intellectual pursuits, but in what way they may be very different from you. And if you feel comfortable speaking about your primary sort of relationship with your Diksha guru, then by all means, yeah.
Yeah, I thank you for that question, because it's always wonderful to reflect on who you're grateful for what everything you've received. And I think on the academic side, we've already talked about it, right? I've mentioned Shonaka Rishi Prabhu, Professor Narasimhachari, and Krishna Kshetra Swami, Tamal Krishna Goswami. Professor Joseph O'Connell was a very important influence for a short time, but he was another example.
He was. Do you know?
No.
Joseph, he was at in Toronto? Or?
Yeah.
He was like the OG Chaitanya Vaishnavism scholar, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah, and then and he met Prabhupada on a number of occasions, or?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. At least I know of one recorded conversation.
Well, that's a very
yes
famous and loaded conversation, because female Diksha guru comes up in that conversation, right?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but you had some interaction with him before he passed, yeah.
Yeah, he spent, what was it? I think it was a year in Oxford.
Oh, wow.
At the Oxford Center. I think he was. What was he? I forget his formal position there, but he was teaching there and guiding students. And he wasn't my formal supervisor, but he was another example of someone who really could balance tradition with scholarship very well, but from the other side. In other words, he was not a Gaudiya Vaishnava himself, and yet I saw in him someone who was so generous towards the tradition while never cutting it slack when it was important, when his academic integrity needed that, right? So he was another, I think, example. But your question was more related to my spiritual or devotional mentors, and there I'd say, well, first of all, my parents. They've had such a deep influence, continue to do so in my life, right? I was homeschooled, and they really, my formation was through Srimad Bhagavatam that my mother taught me at home. My father gave me a wonderful example of leading a career that provided stability and comfort for the family, while at the same time being thoroughly dedicated to a sense of mission and community as well. So my parents were crucial, and then I would say there were three key Shiksha gurus in my formation, especially early on, and they were Ganapati Swami, Gopal Krishna Goswami, and Hanumatpreshaka Swami. And Ganapati Swami he used to come to Boise twice a year in his camper, and he really taught us a lot of the foundations of what it means to be a devotee, but also not just philosophically. I remember the time right after Janmashtami on Vyas Puja morning, he came into our kitchen and he pulled me and my brother out and he said, "We can't start Vyas Puja in a mess like this. If we have to start late, we start late. If we cook a fewer dishes, it's okay. Come, let's do this." And he's the first one who taught me to clean systematically. Like, it was an incredible experience of look behind that, and so some really fundamental things like that. But of course, philosophically also. Gopal Krishna Goswami coming to Boise every year growing up, and when it came time to take Diksha, it could have been Gopal Krishna Goswami or Hanumatpreshaka Swami. And my entire family is actually initiated by Gopal Krishna Goswami. My parents, my grandparents, my uncle and aunt, and my brother, my wife. Oh, wow. Everyone, basically everyone. He's Diksha Guru, but Kul Guru also. For the family. And so he's very much, his words are really meaningful towards me. With Hanumatpreshaka Maharaj, I took initiation in 1999. I requested him in 98, and it was just before I left home for the first time to go to Oxford. And I really felt like that shelter and that connection was really important at that time when I was leaving home. And my relationship with him has been, he's very, very academic and intellectual. He has a consistent record of intellectual and academic engagement, especially in South America, but also here in North America. And one of the things I've appreciated over the years is how encouraging he has been of this path of service. Right? Very, very supportive and encouraging. But perhaps the most valuable thing is actually exactly the opposite, where because my tendency is to have my head in the clouds and to be in this world of scholarship and so on, his approach to Krishna consciousness is so grounded and so down to earth and even urgent. It's not it's a real thing for him. We have to do this by the end of this life. It's not something, anartha nivritti. He always says anartha nivritti is not this process that goes on for 35 years, right? No, it's one amongst 8 steps. And you have to, okay, there'll be some leftovers, but you have to get over it and then get to Nishtha, we got to do this.
Let's get on with it.
Exactly. So he doesn't, he's not someone who wallows in or allows others to wallow. I remember writing a letter to him once, and it was about some practical matter questions about his visit or something like that. And this was maybe a year after initiation. I was giving an update about myself, asking about him. And then at the end, I signed off by saying, and Guru Maharaj, please give me some taste for chanting the holy names. I don't have any taste. And it was an entirely kind of, formulaic thing. This is the sort of thing I'm supposed to say.
Like a performative,
exactly. Yeah. This is what I'm supposed to say to my guru. I just got initiated. Now I'm supposed to say this. Yeah. And what was fascinating is in his reply, he ignored all the practical issues, practical, and then went straight to that line and said, let's talk about this. You've been chanting for how many years? Why don't you have taste yet? Like, how have you been chanting for that many years without taste?
Wow.
And I was like, oh, what? I didn't mean to say that, Guru Maharaj. Actually, I really enjoyed chanting. I could do it better, but and all of a sudden it was real, right?
Yeah,
It went from this formulaic thing to this very real thing about, okay, I got to progress. This is a real thing. If I don't have taste, then let's figure out why not.
Yeah.
So that's the piece that really drew me to him, and I've really appreciated over the years, is that he's very grounded. Even though he's so intellectual, he doesn't lose the immediacy of bhakti.
That's beautiful.
It's really nice.
Nam, you were earlier this morning, you were mentioning something about Radhika Ramana Prabhu being a father.
Oh yeah,
as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's something I'm always interested in, how devotees, are like parents. And what has your experience been? Are you homeschooling your kids? We're homeschooling our kids too. So yeah, so it's always interesting to hear. And your kids are much older actually than my kids. So just wanted to know a little bit about your experience with them.
Most of the homeschooling is being done by Amrita Keli, my wife, and she does a wonderful job, a fabulous job. And I participate as much as I can. But it's such a it's such a joy and challenge, both being a father and being parents together and doing this. It's such a wonderful journey. I think the early years were the toughest so far. Like, there's no question about it. It's really where everything in our life came to a halt. And I was living in Virginia at the time. We were living in Virginia, Williamsburg. And I was very lucky to have a job as a professor because my time was flexible and I could, I didn't have to be 8 to 5 in the office.
Yeah.
But those long sleepless nights and, the challenges of just the basics, of everything from diaper changes to trying to get them to sleep, to worrying about sicknesses and about are we doing enough to raise them properly, and all the anxieties that come with being a parent. Are we letting them down? And I think with homeschooling, this is a thing where, on one level, my mother gives seminars on homeschooling all over the world.
Your mom is like the acharya of homeschooling now, right? Like,
she came on the podcast.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. She enjoyed it a lot.
I think I got a lot of feedback from that one. People really like that one.
And so,
which is just, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to name, like, it's amazing and it's wonderful, but that also ratchets the pressure up, right? Because you're just not like just a homeschooling family.
You're homeschool Shiromani.
Yeah, right.
That's what I called you this morning.
Homeschool Shiromani.
The crush jewel of all homeschoolers.
Yeah. And but the flip side of that is also like, that's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of eyes on you and your family and your kids and your wife as the primary homeschooler, or
Yeah. It's and I co-delivered many of those seminars in her early years. Now she travels mostly on her own because my schedule has become really busy, but we did those together. And so it comes on one level with a lot of conviction in homeschooling. And on the other hand, it must be every other week that Amrita and I are talking and saying, are we doing enough? Are we letting them down? Is this right? Is this and so parenting anxieties are real. They're
totally.
And when you take that much responsibility for the future of your children, the thing you worry about most is, am I going to look back and go, I didn't do the right thing. I messed them up because of my, we weren't ready to do homeschooling. We weren't good enough to do homeschooling. We did it, right?
Yeah.
And so that fear is something that I heard over and over again when I was doing these homeschooling seminars, and my mother still hears them. And I was able to speak to them as a student, but now I'm able to speak to them as a parent and say, yeah, I understand.
Yeah. Oh, that's so great.
And it'll still be okay, right? Like there's you will still do a great job, and they will still come out great. And so even if they were going to school, you would still have these worries.
Yeah.
Right. No parent who cares doesn't have these concerns of, am I not being the best parent I can? Right? So it's okay. And just keep on it. And that's what we tell each other. We say, we look at the alternatives and we say, nope, we're just going to keep going.
What are your hopes for your kids? Because like there's different ways to look at it. Like you can just say, I just want them to be happy, or I just want them to be a devotee, or I just want them to be attracted to Krishna consciousness. I want to be materially successful. Like, where do you see?
I just want them to get into college at the age of 12.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Why can't you do it? I did it.
I did it. Yeah, my brother.
What's taking you so long? You're 13 already. Come on.
It's
what kind of, like, have you put? Is there any pressure? Like, tell us about that.
Yeah, it's. I'm glad you asked that, because it's interesting. Chaitanya, particularly my older one, he's 13, and he's really brainy. He's really intelligent, and he often speaks of, like, can I go to college now? Or I'm too late, right? I was almost 13, and so I'm often in the role of saying, there's no rush.
Yeah,
it's okay, and you're doing amazing, and this is great. And what happened to me, which is the honest truth, is it was mostly unplanned. Like my mother didn't have this plan, my father didn't, I didn't.
Right.
It just happened.
Someone had come to the restaurant and they saw you and they're like, oh, you should do a college class. You know the story about.
Yeah.
And that's how it happened.
By
basically.
the restaurant. So your family ran the
Govinda's restaurant.
Govinda's restaurant and the center, which was essentially your home.
Yes.
For a long time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was my mother and my father were overworked. Like, they were running this restaurant. We were studying on one of the tables in between helping customers. And then we're running a temple. And she's like, I've taught everything I can to this kid. I don't know what more to do. And this professor comes and says, why don't you consider giving him a class in English? He does English well. And so it was just going to be one class, and it was going to be a supplement to the homeschooling she was going to continue. And I just loved it so much that it kind of developed from there. So now I'm most in the position of saying we're trying really hard not to place that pressure on the kids. Even as they enjoy listening to my seminars when they're live streamed, or coming with me on some occasions, even as they enjoy hearing about stories of my childhood and what I did, and even as they're, I think, genuinely proud of that, trying to find that balance and saying, yes, but your path can be entirely different. Yeah. And that's perfectly okay, right? Let's see how things develop and how Krishna wants you to develop. And so
that's so kudos to you for doing that. And also I can imagine, like, that's a tough shadow to live under, as a kid, at an age where anyway you're battling so many insecurities, but now you've got this sort of celebrity dad that's, among other things, a celebrity for something that happened to him at about the same age you are. Right?
Yeah.
That's got to be tough.
Yeah, it's like living with that Doogie Howser, right?
Yeah, living with Doogie Howser dad. Well, they rebooted the show. That's a whole other thing. They rebooted the show. My daughter watched it, and I was like, listen, let me tell you a story about Radhika Ramana Prabhu. No, but they did reboot the show. But I mean, right, to live under that kind of, that shadow or that pressure, it's got to be difficult. And then also, like, I mean, for other families, right? Do you ever, like, encounter devotees who express to you, like, guilt about, like, not being able to homeschool, or maybe they tried it and then they didn't? And full disclosure here, my wife and I don't homeschool our daughter and haven't. And we're both in the field of education in different ways. My wife, as you know, is an elementary school teacher, and I work in a university. So for us, it wasn't the right fit.
Yeah.
But yeah, how do you have you encountered devotees who kind of on the other side of things?
Oh, certainly all the time. And what I tell them, and my mother tells them as well, is it's not it's not the educational modality you use that's going to make your kids successful or Krishna conscious or whatever your hopes or dreams for them are, right? It's who you are as a parent and what you're investing in them, and it's many different factors that come together.
Yeah, right.
And so if parents can't homeschool, then because homeschooling requires a very specific set of circumstances, just pragmatically speaking. And then there's the question of personality, desire, both on the side of the parent and the side of the child, right? So there's all those amorphous things, and then there's some very practical things that need to hold together financially and work, like many things have to come together. So the majority of people are not going to be able to homeschool. That's why it's not the dominant form of education, and that we recognize that, right? So our concern has been, whatever the educational method is, let's try to add Krishna intentionally to that. And often for me, that has been encouraging parents to add some family study of Bhagavatam together. As a family, to study Srimad Bhagavatam, to read it, to enjoy it, to immerse yourself in it, not in a lecture format, not as teacher and student, not as, did you learn these, or trying to quiz them on facts from the stories, not that level, or not even values education. It's not that didactic approach, but really doing it together as a family, just for the sheer joy of talking about it and thinking about it together.
Right.
And when you do that, that's when you help a child develop their identity as a devotee and to hold on to that identity as the years go by. So that's the piece that I think I emphasize the most outside of the modality of education, whether it's homeschooling or public school or private school or charter school, whatever it might be.
What age would that start?
Very early. So that group family time can begin as soon as they're able to just sit and talk, really.
Right.
They don't even have to be able to read, but they can participate.
Yeah.
And then as soon as they can read, then they get a translation to read, which it takes a little while. They go through it slowly, and maybe then, they do one and others do several to keep things moving along. But kids can do it with Chaitanya, one of my favorite memories of his childhood, favorite memories of all time, I think, is when he was barely able to sit up. He was just a toddler. Maybe a tiny bit older. But anyway, he was able to babble. And I would put him on my lap. We'd sit on the floor. I'd put him on my lap. We'd open the Bhagavatam, and I would tell him to repeat the verses, And so I would recite, Sarva Dharman Parityaja, and we've got a video of this. It's just the cutest thing in the world. Yeah. And then we read a verse together, and then we go through the pictures, and I tell him the story of Hiranyakashipu and Prahlad, and then I tell him, now you tell me the story. And he would tell me the story. And they, of course, toddlers love repetition, right? So they would do that. And what was interesting, that we're getting on a tangent, but what was interesting was, what struck me, what I learned from that one session was, when I asked him after the story was over, I said, why was Hiranyakashipu a demon? And I'm not sure why I asked him this question, but I said, why was he? Because, he was telling me the story. He said, Hiranyakashipu was bad. I said, why was he bad? In his version. And of all the things he could have said, he said, because he pushed Prahlad off of his lap.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, pushing him off a cliff, putting him in a pot, that was like interesting, cool, weird. I'm not sure he understood the consequences of that.
Right. That's not as real to him.
Yeah,
right?
But pushing him off his lap, like he was there sitting on my lap. Right. And I came to realize, this piece of real estate here belongs to him. Yes. And for a child, like this big home, whether it's big or small, makes no difference. Yeah. Right. But the lap is his. Yeah. And think about the story of Dhruva as well, right? Yeah. What's the thing that sparks it? It's he gets refused the lap of his father. Right? So
it's not really the throne, it's the lap of the father.
Of his father.
Yeah.
And so that's when I realized, wow, that's so interesting, so powerful to see the story from the perspective of a child. Like what matters, what makes Hiranyakashipu a demon is not all those bad things he did. It's that.
That's so cool. Fascinating.
Well, it's what, some of our mutual friends have coined this term, making bhakti matter.
Yeah.
And that's where bhakti really matters, right?
Yes.
Like that's where it connects to their real world experience.
Yeah.
Do you feel like homeschooled kids, yourself, your kids, do you worry about missing out on certain aspects, whether it's socio, emotional, whether it's just sort of cultural experiences? Do you try to balance out their homeschooling with other things?
Yeah.
Yes. So definitely that's something that we try to do intentionally, right? Like with any I think educational system, there's going to be some blind spots and weaknesses, and you have to cover for that. You have to do that intentionally. You have to add to it. And I think with homeschooling, the part you have to add for is the social aspect. And so, we have them join their local recreational soccer league, and they really enjoy that, spending time with the kids. They play with their neighbors. So we try to create opportunities for them to have those social interactions.
I'm also wondering about resiliency, though, because that's like grit, resiliency. It's kind of
I always wonder about that.
Like, how do you make sure, right? Like do you ever bully your children just to give them the experience of being bullied?
Exactly.
Do you take their lunch money, stuff them into a locker? These are the formational things, right?
I went to public school.
Do you give them do you have gym class at home where they just have to suffer through being really bad at a sport and running the mile? And I'm being facetious, right? But that's also an aspect that a lot of us look back on on our education, and they're like, that was also what sort of formed me and made me into the person I am. So how do you account for that?
Yeah, I don't think I could bully my kids if I tried.
You could hire a bully.
I'm not entirely convinced that resiliency is necessarily born from poor experiences early on in life, right? I think the more fundamental aspect of resiliency is actually the deep conviction that there is stability in this world, that despite everything that goes on, people are generally trustworthy, and I am loved, and there's stability in the world. And if you give that, then I'm sure there's going to be times when they go out into the world and they're going to feel like they're not good enough, or they're beat up in some way, and I remember those occasions, leaving, home for the first time and going, wow, this is a struggle being in the world. And
did you feel like an alien or something when you went to college, and all of a sudden, right? Because I imagine, maybe I'm wrong, you tell me, but I imagine even in terms of pop culture knowledge and things, you were probably a little bit out of your depths, right?
Yeah, the pop culture references were, they'd go right by me. I knew a lot of references from Chaitanya Charitamrita, but
those don't quite work the same way when you're hanging out on the quad. You're a frat party, and you're like, "Hey guys, that Gopinath Acharya story, wild."
So those did go by.
Yeah.
Those did go by. But the interesting thing about homeschooling is that, socially speaking, and I think this is something people forget, your greatest social skills don't necessarily come from being in a room with 30 other people who are exactly born in the same months that you are, right? That's a very artificial experience that is never replicated in life after you finish elementary school. You're always in a world where you're dealing with people of multiple capacities.
That's so true.
That's so interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
And historically speaking, that mode of education is also relatively new, right?
Yeah.
It comes from a very urban and state-driven educational system, which I'm not saying is bad. I'm just saying it is an artificial construct. And
what the idea of separate grades for ages.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you can't enter this grade unless you're born, August or earlier.
The cutoff dates.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in reality, we know of not homeschooling as a historically ancient practice, but the one-room schoolhouse. Whether you look at ancient or not even ancient, pre-modern, Western societies in Europe or the United States, or you look at India, it was always the one-room schoolhouse, and different age groups working together and studying together. And I think homeschooling does a really good job of helping students be able to relate to everyone from an 80-year-old to their 2-year-old sibling or to a neighbor or to a friend or to a social group. And that's what helped me when I went to college, right? Like I understood how I needed to interact with people who are 4 years older or 6 or 10, or my professors who are 3 times my age, right?
Yeah.
That was something that was inherent in me. And so that's the part of social skills I think homeschooling actually does very well. Now, in terms of the social activities bit, that's the part that we need to supplement. But in terms of social skills, I know way too many young people who come out of an educational system with moving through their age groups who cannot make small talk with anyone outside their generational sliver. Their subculture, that's it, and beyond that or below that, they don't know what to do while they're sitting next to someone on the subway. And I think that's a skill that homeschooling actually does give you pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah. In the context of like devotional communities, I think by and large, homeschooling is really seen as a positive thing. And, you're probably sort of congratulated for it. In other settings, in sort of mainstream secular settings or in settings like among colleagues, particularly colleagues who maybe politically lean left, which a lot of the academy is like that, do you ever feel, have you ever gotten a sort of a sense of like judgment around being homeschooled? And I ask this especially because, at least in this country, there's such a link between homeschooling, or such a perceived link between homeschooling and kind of evangelical Christianity, politically conservative, right-wing, kind of, sometimes even very like anti-government. And I'm wondering if you've ever sort of sensed folks kind of judging you once they find out you're homeschooled. Yeah.
I've definitely felt that. There's that link, all those links you talked about, and then there's also the link of like the tiger mom or tiger parent, and someone who's going to are you driving your kids into the wall, into the ground? Are you driving them insane because you're pushing them too hard? Right. There's that set of concerns as well.
And that probably also lines up to some like stereotypes about Asian, like South Asian and East Asian parents, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I forget where it was, the Washington Post or something. I didn't read them, but there was like a whole series of articles. I think I read one on homeschooling, and it was 6 articles. Maybe one of them was, you would say, relatively positive, and the other 5 talked about the potential for domestic violence and abuse and everything from that to indoctrination of kids in very, like you're saying, very right wing, and sort of we're going to do our own thing here and we have our own militia, and so there's that full range of concerns or doubts that are there. So but it's people are judgmental about parenting. It's just one of those things where no matter what you do, someone's going to come and tell you you're doing it wrong.
Right. Yeah.
And they did it right. I grew up like this, and we always did it like this, and I don't know what you're doing to your kids.
Yeah.
And every generation gets to listen to how they're doing it wrong.
I get to listen to how I'm doing it wrong from my daughter. She's like, "You're not very good at this parenting
thing." Yeah. So I think that's just part of the parenting experience, is being able to swallow some of that.
Yeah. Switching gears, but just this idea of kind of being judged by colleagues just reminds me, and I know this might get into some touchy territory, but you're very publicly a devotee, right? Your content is widely available, but I'm thinking even visually, right? Like you maintain I think I don't know what the Sanskrit for buzz cut is, but you have that kind of like, right? Like you keep a sikha for as long as I've known you. Yep. So, and you wear kantimala in a very kind of obvious way. So at least with those sort of visual cues, particularly in a field where people know what those things mean, right? Anyone studying Hinduism will know. How have you navigated that sort of being so visually, publicly, a practitioner, a Hindu practitioner, if we want to use that identifier, more specifically a Vaishnava, more specifically a Gaudiya, but then also that kind of crosses into maybe some assumptions about Brahminical status, and that can get very, it's a tough thing to look and sound like a male Brahmin Hindu in in academia right now. It's like you're probably seen as probably the most oppressive identity right now.
Yeah.
How have you navigated that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess there's so many ways I can talk about that, but those different academic various identities or pushes that sorry, I'm trying to think of how best to answer this. So I really think that as I give my classes as a devotee, I'm always conscious of the fact that I have multiple audiences. I have the audience sitting in front of me. I have potentially my colleagues at work, and I have the broader Academy of Religion as well. And I think if I'm speaking to all of those audiences, that's much more difficult to do than just speaking to one audience. But it keeps me honest because I have to have a holistic identity as both a scholar and a Vaishnava. I can't compartmentalize. I don't want to be secretly one and then secretly another. Is when I'm writing an academic article, I know that devotees will read it. And if they read it, then I want them to be able to gain something out of it. And I want to be able to say, yeah, you can read this and I have nothing to hide, right? And I think similarly, when I'm speaking to devotees, I want to be able to tell academics, yes, I'm preaching a sermon here, and that's a mode of talking, but there's nothing I want to hide here. There's no worry, there's no concern, there's nothing that would terribly embarrass me. Now, having said that, I know that there are opportunities in the academic world that I have not gotten because of my being forthcoming as a devotee.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah. In terms of, I know there's job opportunities, that interviews that have not progressed further. I know that there are probably invitations to participate in panels or books that haven't come from that. But then there are other opportunities that have emerged precisely because people want someone who can navigate those two. Like my work in the Society for Hindu-Christian Studies, for example. That is a space in the Academy of Religion where people are not only comfortable with, but eager or interested in the idea of navigating these spaces, these identities together, right?
Yeah.
So sure, any identity is going to close certain doors, right? It's going to open some doors and it's going to close other doors. And I think at the beginning, this used to make me, it used to make me insecure that, well, am I self-sabotaging in some way? Mm-hmm. Because a lot of people, religious people, and I don't mean just Hare Krishnas, I mean a lot of religious people go into the academy and they hide their religious identity. They don't speak of it. They intentionally reject any invitation to speak of that side of their identity. And I thought, am I self-sabotaging by being so open like this? And in the end, I thought, well, this is who I am. Like this is as I'm as much a Vaishnava as I am a scholar. And so if someone can't really accept me for who I am holistically, then maybe I'm not going to be happy there either.
Yeah,
right? Like maybe that job is not cut out for me. I'm going to be miserable there. Because I've made certain choices in my life for who I want to be. And unless I'm willing to change those choices, then I might as well find a circumstance where I'm welcome holistically as a human being. And that's okay, right? Like there's many ways to succeed in this world. There's not just one path. And everyone brings their identity with them.
Yeah.
So if certain identities work in certain spaces, great. That's like all kudos to them. And if my identity works in this space, okay, then I'm happy as well, right? So I think it's really, for me, it's been a journey trying to decide exactly how I want to present myself. And in the end, for me, the decision was being open about who I am is going to be the best, right? That's going to be, like, you go to my Wikipedia entry and it's got both my names there. In fact, the primary heading, I think, is Radhika Ramana Das, and then Ravi Gupta is in parentheses. So I know anyone Googling me for any kind of thing is going to come across that identity of mine. And that's okay. It comes with certain challenges and now, one of the things that makes it easier is the fact that I'm of Indian background.
Yes.
So it means that I can own it. 3 generations of my family are Hare Krishnas, right? Or now 4 if I count my kids.
Wow.
So like,
Right. So who's going to accuse you of being a, brainwashed hippie or something, right?
Exactly.
That's not going to.
That's not gonna work. So that's convenient, right? But then that identity also comes with certain inconveniences as well, right? Which is now, for example, the male Brahmin identity, which is not at all cool, right?
Do you know about this, Nam?
I don't. No, I was just going to ask about that.
Yeah. Do you want to just give like a sort of 30-second sort of snapshot of what we're referring to and what's going on kind of right now in academia, and particularly in Hindu studies?
Yeah, one of the foundations of the academic study of religion, but also of the humanities in general, is ensuring that marginalized voices get heard. And historically, it's those who are socially privileged, whose voices have been dominant. This has almost always been men. It's almost always been people who are at the top of whatever social hierarchy is present in a society, whether that hierarchy is racial or wealth-driven or a combination of many things. And people who have identities that are marginalized, and particularly today, recognizing that many of those marginalized identities intersect with each other. One could be a low-caste woman, for example, that those voices tend to get really squelched, right? And so in a Hindu context, it's the male Brahmin identity that has really been the dominant voice. They have been the authors of most Sanskrit texts. They have been the leaders and teachers and gurus and all of that, right? And I'm a man and, Brahmin initiated, right? Now, of course, the way that we understand who a Brahmana is different. And should the opportunity arise, then I'm happy typically with an academic or devotee or whoever to have a robust discussion of what this means to me and what it means to my tradition and ways in which it's different from the sorts of Brahminical structures that we've seen historically, particularly in medieval times, but also ways in which we can still improve in that area, right? Ways in which that is, I recognize, a privilege that I carry. So that identity has been a subject of particular interrogation in the American Academy of Religion in recent years, and amongst Hindu student bodies, and even in areas of law as well, with concerns about caste discrimination being a form of discrimination that's still well and alive.
Wow.
And so,
by the way, can we just pause there to say, like, that is the best, like 30 to whatever, 30-second to a minute summary of this I have ever heard, that you managed to actually describe it in completely thoughtful, objective, non-politicized terms, whereas like everyone else, this is like hot button, like really like highly politicized, depending on how you feel about this. But you managed to actually capture it so well in a way that is not about scoring political points or pushing an agenda, but just kind of describes it in really kind of clear, thoughtful terms. So I just wanted to appreciate that.
Thank you. Yeah. So, and for inhabiting that identity means that I can learn a little bit from my white male colleagues as well, right? Like they inhabit their sense of privilege as well, and they have to work through it, and they have to recognize that they're going to have to, work a little bit harder to uplift those whose voices are not as well heard, and maybe to take a step back every once in a while to allow their voices to be heard. So I think I think the key thing for me is the recognition that no matter who you are and what identities you inhabit, there's going to be certain liabilities and certain advantages, privileges that come with that. And I've certainly dealt with my share of liabilities in terms of being openly a practitioner of religion in the academy. I've also enjoyed my share of privileges as well, in being a man, being a Brahmin, being a Hindu, and being able to claim that this is my family tradition. And so who's going to tell me not to keep a shikha, right? So there's pluses and minuses. But overall, for me, if I can be who I am holistically, right, recognizing, and I think people who are reasonable in both a devotee community setting and both in academia will recognize that we speak in different languages in different settings, right? Like my mentor for my master's degree in Oxford was Keith Ward, Regius Professor of Divinity. He's one of the dons of Christchurch. And by the very nature of that position, not only is it one of the most prestigious theology positions in the world, but you're also, by nature of that position, one of the what's the word, deacons, or no, it's not deacon, but you've got a formal position in the Anglican Church. Right.
Oh,
okay. And you're required to preach on a certain interval.
So everyone who's been a don at Christchurch, when Christchurch is like for those of us who are, on this side of the pond and unfamiliar, so Christchurch would be considered one of the colleges that form Oxford
University, and one of the most
and it's
prestigious.
Probably the most prestigious, I think.
Yeah, that's where Hogwarts was filmed, and I think that's what's made it the most prestigious.
Oh, Gopal Hari took me there. Gopinath Acharya and him, they gave me a tour of that place.
Yeah.
I went to Oxford.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. That was, when was that? Like 2014 or something.
Yeah.
How tragic that Oxford's rich, storied history is now condensed into Hogwarts.
Yeah, right.
But so what you're saying, the dawn of the most prestigious college that makes up perhaps the most prestigious university in the entire world is also a religious figure, and always has been.
Yes.
It's part of the description of the job.
Wow. Right. So when he's preaching in the chapel in Christchurch, he's speaking a different language to a different audience than when he's lecturing to me and my fellow students, right? Yeah. And we understand that. He understands that. So code switching, different languages, right? This is something we do as human beings. I'm talking to you in a different vein than I would talk to my students at the university. If anyone's halfway reasonable or socially competent, they recognize that fact, right? And they're not going to hold it against you unless they have something against the very identity that you inhabit. Like if they don't appreciate the fact that someone is religious or someone is Hare Krishna, then clearly they're not going to appreciate that identity, right? But in that case, then maybe that's not a space that I want to be in anyway, right? Like if it's so hostile to a religious identity, then will I be comfortable? Right. But I think reasonable people recognize that there's a shift in modality, in linguistic forms, and that's okay so long as you're being honest and holistic as a person.
Yeah. And you're fairly optimistic that there are halfway reasonable people that outnumber the unreasonable ones.
I tend to be an optimist when it comes to human beings, that we can reach people and that they can come to some sense of agreement. I know it doesn't always bear out, but in my mind, it's better to be optimistic about people and be disappointed than to be pessimistic about people, because that pessimism usually is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if that optimism is a self-fulfilling prophecy, great. If the pessimism is, then you're stuck, right?
Yeah.
So better to be naive about the world, being kind of benignly naive and be disappointed every once in a while, than start off with this suspicion of the world, and then everything confirms that suspicion. So I think, people can get it. There are some people who can get it, at least.
But why not operate on the premise that people are reasonable and can get it, right? Yeah. That's
just on the visual markers. On a lighter note, my all-time favorite course evaluation from a student, the comment section on course evaluations was, the only reason I come to class is to watch Professor Gupta's ponytail bob up and down as he writes on the board. And so
What?
I think might have seen something like that on Rate My Professor or something.
That's
Remember Rate My
hilarious.
Professor?
I remember Rate My Professor.
and so now
Oh, no.
at some point in the semester, it usually takes about a third of the way through before my students are comfortable. Someone will say, "Can you explain your hairstyle, please?"
Really?
Yeah. And I say, "I've been waiting for this the whole semester. Thank you." And the first thing I say is that this is a retention strategy. Students come to my class just to watch my ponytail bob up and down. So that's what it means.
You get laughs?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, they appreciate it.
Do your students like, speaking of Googling and YouTubing and stuff, do your students like happen upon your like seminars given at a temple or maybe even this podcast? Do you think like, does that happen? Do you hear about that?
Every once in a while.
Yeah.
Every once in a while that happens. I think most people don't have the time or patience to sit through a long seminar or something like that. But for most people it's enough to just recognize that my professor is a practicing Hindu and has some leadership in this.
We're at time.
We're at time. Oh, I could keep
But
going.
we could keep going. I mean, but maybe I think you'll come back for sure. You're like a regular in New Jersey.
Yes.
Yeah, well, you're
It's been really
definitely,
fantastic speaking with you, Prabhu, and getting to know you and everything. It's been really inspiring, I think.
I think this was really healing for Nam. I think Nam had a lot of pent up emotional trauma issues. And
What?
And it's, the whole thing of being envious of Radhika Ramana and everything.
I did, right?
So, we need to heal that. That's good. It's always good when that happens. No, this is amazing. Thank you so much for being here
so
and for
much,
spending
Andrew.
time. And can't wait for the next one. Let's get something on the books soon.
Totally. Thank you again, Prabhu.
Okay.
Thanks.
Wonderful.
Haribol.
Haribol.
Krishna Hare Krishna